Hook, first 20 seconds. In the spring of 1904, a city rose in Missouri that did not look temporary, did not feel temporary, and more than a century later still does not behave like something that was meant to vanish. A city of domes, canals, colossal halls, electric light, and imperial theater. It opened to the world, dazzled millions, and then, almost as suddenly, began to disappear. CTA. Before we go deeper, subscribe and stay with me to the very end, because this story is not just about a World's Fair. It is about what gets remembered, what gets buried, and why some ruins are easier to cover with grass than to explain. Body. History calls it the Louisiana Purchase Exposition. The official version is polished and simple. St. Louis hosted the 1904 World's Fair to celebrate the centennial of the Louisiana Purchase. The fair spread across roughly 1,200 acres of forest park and the Washington University campus. It welcomed nearly 20 million visitors. More than 1,500 buildings, roads, exhibits, lagoons, and monumental spaces were assembled to present America as modern, industrial, scientific, and destined to lead the century ahead. That is the accepted story. But when people look at the surviving photographs, many of them feel something in their gut before they ever form an argument in their mind. This does not look like a temporary event. It looks like a vanished civilization staged as a celebration. It looks too complete, too ornate, too massive, too confident. And that feeling is exactly why the 1904 fair has become a magnet for one of the internet's most persistent historical obsessions. Across Reddit threads, YouTube documentaries, Facebook history groups, and conspiracy communities, the same question keeps returning. What exactly was standing in St. Louis in 1904? Was this truly a temporary city built in a rush by early 20th century labor? Or are the photographs showing us something older, something uncovered, repurposed, and then erased? That is where the mystery begins. Because whatever side a person takes, one fact is unavoidable. The fair was enormous. Not metaphorically enormous. Physically enormous. Visitors moved through palaces, cascades, sculpture courts, bridges, avenues, lagoons, and electrically illuminated facades on a scale that still shocks modern eyes. The visual language was imperial. White facades, grand stairs, towering domes, processional water. It projected permanence. And that is the first crack in the official story. Official museum and library sources explain that most of these great buildings were not stone at all, but staff, a temporary material made from plaster and fiber applied over wood or metal frames. In other words, they were theatrical architecture. Beautiful, fast, and never intended to last. The St. Louis Art Museum, which occupies the former Palace of Fine Arts, notes that most of the exposition structures were impermanent, and that only a very small number were meant to outlast the fair. That answer satisfies many historians, but online, it satisfies almost no one. Because the photographs do not merely show pretty facades. They show extraordinary scale. They show structural confidence. They show an urban dream assembled with a speed that feels nearly impossible to the modern eye. And so people begin doing what people always do when official explanations feel emotionally smaller than the evidence in front of them. They start comparing. They compare the fair to later skyscraper projects. They compare the labor technology of 1901 to 1904 with what came decades afterward. They compare the ornate finish of the palaces to government buildings and museums that took much longer to complete. Then they ask the question that drives the entire alternate theory. How was this done so fast? Ground preparation and major construction accelerated after 1901. The fair opened in April of 1904, even allowing for planning before that. The visible transformation was staggering. Miles of roads and walks, waterworks, bridges, landscaping, the famous Grand Basin and Cascades, vast exhibition halls, towers, domes, statuary, illumination systems, service systems, crowd systems, transportation links, a whole ceremonial city. To believers in the conventional account, the answer is simple. World's fairs were built for spectacle, not longevity. Materials like staff could create the illusion of marble and stone. Enormous workforces could be mobilized quickly. Expositions were engines of image-making. To skeptics, that still leaves too much unexplained. And this is where social media has added fuel to the fire. In Tartaria and mudflood communities especially, users obsess over construction images from Street Louis. They zoom into trenches, retaining walls, stairways, base courses, and partially exposed lower levels. They focus on captions that mention grading, foundation work, and basin construction. They argue that some photos look less like building from scratch and more like excavation around structures that were already there. That interpretation is not accepted by mainstream historians, but it keeps spreading because it gives people a framework that matches their intuition. If the city looks too advanced to have been created in 3 years, then maybe it was not fully created in 3 years. Maybe it was revealed, restored, skinned over, renamed, and later destroyed. That is the emotional power of the theory. Not merely that it accuses historians of error, but that it offers a dramatic alternative to the deep unease people feel when they see those images. Still, we need to be careful. A photograph can ignite suspicion without proving the suspicion true. World's Fair construction often involved terracing, massive grading operations, hidden supports, drainage work, and temporary finishes over complex frames. A trench in a photo does not automatically prove a buried city. A grand facade does not automatically prove ancient stone. The eye can be overwhelmed by beauty and scale and begin to imagine permanence where the builders intended pageantry. Yet even after granting that, the fair remains unsettling, because some parts really were built to last. The most obvious survivor is the Palace of Fine Arts, now the St. Louis Art Museum, still standing over Art Hill like a witness that outlived its century. The flight cage also survived as part of the zoo, so the fair was never purely temporary in the absolute sense. It contained layers, showpieces, permanent anchors, adapted grounds, and a massive visual shell that was both glorious and expendable. That mixture may be one reason the photographs generate so much confusion. Online conversations about the fair usually divide into 3 camps. The first camp trusts the standard historical record. These people point to archives, planning records, contractor photographs, official guidebooks, and the well-documented use of staff as an exposition material. They argue that the fair was an astonishing feat. Yes, but not an impossible one. Spectacle architecture has always used illusion. The grandeur was real, but the permanence was not. The second camp is not fully conspiratorial, but deeply suspicious. These viewers say the official story may be broadly true while still hiding important details about the reuse of earlier infrastructure, about what lay beneath the fairgrounds, or about how much of Forest Park had already been shaped before the exposition. They do not always claim a lost civilization. Sometimes they simply feel the demolition narrative has been too neatly summarized. The third camp is the most radical. In these communities, the fair is treated as evidence of a suppressed world, an older architectural order, perhaps global, perhaps technologically misunderstood, perhaps intentionally erased from public memory. Here the language turns from World's Fair to cover story, from temporary buildings to appropriated monuments, from demolition to destruction of evidence. And then there is electricity. If architecture created the mystery, electricity gave it a pulse. The fair at night was one of the wonders of its age. Contemporary and later sources described the exposition glowing under electric illumination, and Library of Congress material highlights George Westinghouse's role in lighting the grounds. To visitors in 1904, this would have felt close to magical. Not just practical light, but civilizational light. Proof that the future had arrived. Online, that same lighting has become a major point of speculation. Some viewers see more than illumination. They stare at the towers, domes, finials, and radiant reflections and ask whether the buildings were not merely decorated for electricity but somehow participating in it. Whether the metallic ornament, the elevated crowns, and the symmetrical layouts hint at a forgotten relationship between architecture and power itself. That is where Nikola Tesla often enters the story. In online retellings, Tesla becomes the prophet in the margins, the man who would have recognized a hidden energy system, the man whose ideas about wireless transmission are projected backward onto the fair's shining domes. Once Tesla is introduced, the exposition stops being merely suspicious and becomes mythic. The lights are no longer just lights. They become signs of a technological secret. The problem is that the stronger versions of this claim are much harder to verify than the atmosphere makes them seem. Yes, the fair was brilliantly illuminated. Yes, electricity was one of its major attractions. Yes, the Palace of Electricity and the Westinghouse presence turned power itself into spectacle. But turning that into proof of atmospheric energy harvesting or a suppressed electrical architecture requires a leap much larger than the surviving evidence clearly supports. And yet the leap continues because the images invite it. Then, there is the human story. And here the official record is disturbing enough, without any embellishment. The fair did not only display machines, foods, and industry. It displayed people. Scholars and museums alike have documented the racial hierarchy embedded in the exposition, including the so-called anthropology displays, and the exhibition of colonized and indigenous peoples in ways designed to flatter white American assumptions about civilization and progress. The Philippine exhibit, staged only a few years after the United States took control of the islands, became one of the most notorious examples. Human beings were arranged into narratives of empire. Geronimo, too, was present at the fair. The Library of Congress preserves images of him there, and the visual contrast is painful. A man who had once embodied resistance to American expansion appears inside an imperial spectacle built to reassure the public that conquest had become order, that resistance had become display, that the frontier itself had been domesticated and arranged for viewing. This matters because the fair was never just architecture. It was a machine for storytelling. It told Americans what kind of nation they were. It told visitors what kind of world was emerging. It told conquered peoples where they supposedly stood in the hierarchy of civilization. And it told the future that all of this grandeur had been legitimate, intentional, and temporary. That last word, temporary, is where the fair continues to haunt the modern imagination. Because beautiful things vanish all the time. Cities change. Expositions come and go. Demolition is not proof of conspiracy, but when something so visually overwhelming is both celebrated and destroyed within a handful of years, people start to wonder whether the destruction served more than practical purposes. Why demolish so much beauty? Why erase so much scale? Why bury the plan so completely under a park landscape that later generations can stroll across the lawns and barely feel what once stood beneath them? Some of that has ordinary explanations. Maintenance costs, material decay, urban priorities, weather damage. The basic logic of exposition culture. Build to astonish, then dismantle when the crowds are gone. But ordinary explanations do not always satisfy emotional questions, and this mystery is emotional as much as historical. That is why modern posts about the 1904 fair do not read like academic debates. They read like grief. Even people who reject every Tartaria-style theory often still express a sense of loss. They look at those photographs and mourn a civic ambition that feels impossible now. They mourn beauty treated as disposable. They mourn a public culture willing to spend on awe. In that sense, the social media obsession reveals something deeper than historical doubt. It reveals hunger. Hunger for scale. Hunger for wonder. Hunger for a past that felt more grand than the present. Hunger for the possibility that history is still hiding rooms we have not entered. And maybe that is why the Louisiana Purchase Exposition remains so powerful. Not because every radical theory about it is true, but because the fair sits exactly at the intersection where official history, visual evidence, national myth, imperial violence, and internet suspicion all collide. It is too well documented to disappear, too strange to become ordinary, too beautiful to be dismissed, too compromised to be romanticized without caution. So, what exactly was standing in Street Louis in 1904? At minimum, it was one of the greatest theatrical cities ever assembled in the United States, an engineered dream of empire built from a mixture of ambition, artifice, labor, and ideology. At maximum, if you follow the most radical interpreters, it was a glimpse of a buried world, exhumed just long enough to be renamed, repurposed, photographed, and destroyed. Between those two positions lies the real terrain of the mystery, a place where archives speak, photographs whisper, parks conceal, and the internet, for all its noise and exaggeration, keeps returning to one stubborn intuition. Something about this story does not feel finished. Maybe the buildings were exactly what the museums say they were: monumental but temporary, dazzling but hollow, engineered for a single season of glory. Maybe some of the confusion comes from our own distance from that era. We underestimate what coordinated labor could do. We forget how much World's Fairs specialized in illusion. We mistake grandeur for permanence because our own age rarely builds beauty at that scale, unless it intends to keep it. Or maybe there are still layers beneath the accepted version that deserve harder study, not fantasies, not viral edits, but real questions about landscape preparation, surviving substructures, demolition choices, and the politics of how this fair has been remembered. Either way, the ground of Forest Park holds the afterimage, not just in surviving plans and photographs, not just in the art museum still standing above the hill, but in the fact that people continue to look at 1904 and feel that the official caption is too small for the image. And perhaps that is the final truth of the St. Louis World's Fair. A city appeared. A nation called it progress. An empire called it proof. Millions walked through it. Then it was dismantled, buried, landscaped, and folded into memory. But memory has a way of pushing back through the soil. Out through. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment with one sentence only: temporary city or buried truth. And if you want more deep historical mysteries told with atmosphere, evidence, and the questions most people are afraid to sit with, subscribe, because the next story gets even stranger.